So let's get this webinar underway. So Tony Needham, if you want to come in,
okay,
and then we can start the webinar.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks very much. Yeah, so very welcome everyone to this webinar on safety case. So we have scheduled from now until 2:30 for the session. So just to go through the agenda, there's sort of 5 parts to this. So we'll do introductions in just a second, and then we'll move on to an introduction to the Energy Institute and to the Technical and Innovation Programme, which will be covered by myself. Then following on from that, Navdeep will do an overview of the Hydrogen Committee and a background and cover the significance of the safety case work. And then following on from that, Sean Baker will cover the topic itself on safety case. So that's covering phase 1 and phase 2, phase 1 being a research report, which was published in October 2022, and our guidance, which was more recently published in May 2023. And then following on from that, Tony Byrne from Proteum will cover the EI incident data work and an overview of the Safe End project, which we have an interest in and are partially involved in. And you will see that this session is being recorded, and so this is for anybody who has registered will receive it by email, and those who are unable to join today as well and have registered will receive the recording. So do the speakers just want to turn on your camera and just say hello? So Navdeep.
Yeah, sure. I'll start. Hello, everybody. Great to see that we've got almost 80 participants. In fact, we have hit 80 participants, and it's only 2 minutes into the webinar. So really reassuring to know that this is something of key interest to many stakeholders within the Energy Institute and our members. So yeah, my name is Dr. Navdeep Singh. I work for Progressive Energy as a senior project engineer. I primarily work in the field of hydrogen blending, and currently I'm one of the managers for the High Deploy project, where we're trying to initiate policy change so that we can blend up to 20% hydrogen into the UK distribution networks. I'll be chairing the rest of the session today, and yeah, a warm welcome to everybody. I'll pass over to Tony Byrne.
Hi, Tony Byrne. I'm head of EPC and construction for Proteum. We're a green energy developer focusing in on hydrogen mainly. So that's me.
Thanks, Tony. Sean?
Afternoon all, Sean Baker. I'm a principal consultant at ERM, primarily working in the area of technical safety with a current focus on hydrogen. I was project manager and technical lead for our work on the safety case development work on behalf of EI.
Okay, thanks very much. And I've just realised I haven't introduced myself. So I'm Tony Needham, Technical Manager at the Energy Institute. So I manage our Hydrogen Committee and our Electrical Safety Committee and all the associated projects. Just before we start with an introduction to the Energy Institute, I just want to say this is our first technical webinar for both the Technical and Innovation Programme and as a hydrogen topic itself. We are planning a series of these webinars, so there's going to be one webinar a month from now up until April 2024. So if you're interested, please keep an eye out and register for any forthcoming webinars, and we will have some further webinars on the hydrogen topic as well. So just a brief introduction to the Energy Institute. So who is the Energy Institute? So we're a chartered professional membership body for people who work across the energy world. We're a registered charity and a non-governmental organisation, and we've got 20,000 members. We've 120 company members and 44 technical partners supporting the work that we do. We've over 100 technical committees and sub-working groups, and we were formed back in 2003 as a merger between the Institute of Energy and Institute of Petroleum. And we've been around, believe it or not, for over 100 years. So EI's role, so as part of the EI's 2030 strategy, the EI's role is threefold. So attracting, developing and equipping the diverse future energy workforce, informing energy decision-making through convening expertise and advice, and enabling industry and consumers to make energy lower carbon, safer and more efficient. So we deliver our role through offering a variety of training courses online and in person, such as Energy Fundamentals. We also have a young professional network, various outreach programs to engage future leaders, such as Generation 2050. And we also have a monthly magazine called New Energy World. We host conferences, including International Energy Week, which is hosted on an annual basis in sort of towards the end of February, early March. We host a range of technical committees and engage global stakeholders. We host webinars on interesting topics and current topics. We host technical workshops. We collaborate with a variety of industry bodies, including other institutes and associations. We produce research reports and good practice guidance, and we continue to build on our transition topics. So the footprint of the EI, or the work that we do, is sort of outlined here. So our main priorities are to build on health safety, asset integrity, digitalization, climate resilience in energy. And our focus is the four main pillars there. So decarbonising fossil fuels, which also takes in hydrogen, as you can see, deploying sustainable fuels, integrating power systems and renewables, and better managing energy efficiency. You can become a member of the Energy Institute. There's different types or levels of membership, which includes student membership, or being an associate member, or an affiliate member, a technician member, or a fully fledged member if you're already working within the energy industry. There's more information online on this, and you can also contact our membership department. But if you do wish to join, you can you can join using that web link there, energyins.org/join. There's a range of benefits to becoming a member of the Energy Institute. So there's professional recognition, professional development, access to EI training courses and events, and you're offered a discounted rate for those. You also have discounted access to technical publications. There's a free monthly digital Energy World magazine and various networking opportunities provided. If you do want to become a member of the Energy Institute, as part of this webinar, we're offering 20% discount, and you just use that code there, so HydroWeb20, and just put that in your application. If you have any questions about becoming a member, or want to know more details about membership and what's on offer, please contact the membership department at that email address there. And obviously there's a lot of information online on our website as well, on the membership site. Just covering our technical and innovation program. This is where I work, and this hosts this sort of the hydrogen committee. So very quick overview of that and what we do. So our technical program is delivered mainly by our technical committees. We have dozens of committees and sub-working groups, and these are made up of technical specialists, energy companies, regulators, trade associations, and others as invited, such as experts and specialists in a certain topic area. Our work program is funded by our members. We currently have over 40 technical partners within the technical program funding that program. And every year we have between 30 and 40 new projects, so new topic areas every year. And these are delivered, or we appoint specialist consultants to deliver on that, whether it be a research report or guidance documents. So we work with the committees, the committee members and consultants to deliver on each piece of work. So the aim of the Technical and Innovation Programme is to accelerate the transition through collaboration in diverse energy sectors with a more recent proactive shift towards low carbon. The Technical Innovation Programme is a hub of technical excellence for industry. We work with technical experts from over 50 leading energy companies, regulators and academia, and together we look to pursue shared goals and outcomes. We work with all energy sectors, that includes oil and gas, and that covers upstream, midstream and downstream. We also cover onshore and offshore wind, thermal power, solar, battery storage, power systems, hydrogen and CCUS. And the EI's Good Practice and Innovation Programme is instrumental in keeping people, assets and the environment safe and secure. We've over 750 titles in our portfolio. That includes research reports and good practice guidance, from health and safety, risk management to lab test methods, with around 50 titles published on an annual basis. And we're also starting to host webinars on specific topics and publications. So as I said, this is the first of those webinars out of a series of webinars. This is just an organogram of our technical and innovation committee, the various technical committees which oversee and drive forward our technical programme. At the Epicenter, you see the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee. That's made up of our 40+ technical partners who fund our technical programme, and they approve our technical programme every year. And so the three main areas that we cover are fuels and fuels handling, health, safety and environment, and transition. So the energy transition, that's delivered by 5 main technical committees. So that includes the Power Systems Committee, the Hydrogen Committee, Carbon Capture, Utilisation and Storage Committee, Offshore and Onshore Wind. The fuel quality measurement and handling topic areas or themes are covered by the Aviation Fuel Handling Committee, Test Method Standardization Committee, Fuel Distribution Committee and Hydrocarbon Management Committee. And the Safety, Health and Environment topic areas are covered by Process Safety Committee, Managing Human Performance Committee, Ageing and Life Extension Committee, Environment Committee and Health Committee. And there's more information on these on our website, and also if you want to contact me afterwards, I can direct you to the person responsible for managing each of those committees. So it's just gives an overview of the technical partners who fund our technical programme and are involved in all the work that we do. They sit on the main committees and the working groups as well. And just to summarise the 2022 activity, we had 54 publications published last year. We had 30 technical workshops and we delivered over 50 presentations. So that's just an idea of the work that we deliver in a year. We also produce an annual report which is available to download from our website. So that's just a very quick overview of the EI and the technical programme. So I hope that makes sense to you and that you have a better understanding of what it is that we do. And so now just over to Nav, if you'd like to just speak about the Hydrogen Committee and also the safety casework, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I can see some comments in the chat and people are keen to get stuck into the details of the project itself. So I will certainly keep this brief. The Hydrogen Committee was first started in 2019 off the back of an initiation from the EI Council. Clearly at the time there was the idea of hydrogen, clean energy, renewable technologies, climate change had certainly risen high up on the agendas, and so the EI thought it was a good idea to set up a hydrogen committee to help the industry to transition towards a hydrogen economy. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I don't know. Right, there we go.
Thank you. So the EI Council made the request back in 2018 for the decarbonisation agenda, which then led to a year later the hydrogen committee being set up. So in 2019 there was the key themes were identified, which were CCUS, hydrogen, and integrated power networks. Following on from that, the non-competitive technical challenges were identified by a wide group of stakeholders from the industry, regulators, and academia, with over 100 participants, which guided where the funding and the research should take place. In 2020, the hydrogen stakeholder meeting identified 6 project proposals. And of those 6 project proposals, 6 working groups were established. And those working groups were then set up to conduct specific research funded by the STAC funding unit, which Tony has already taken us through. So next slide, please. So you can see here some of the priority projects and areas that have been the focus of the Hydrogen Committee. So every year STAC funds key projects, and it's expected that each year STAC will continue to fund projects which will help enable a hydrogen economy here in the UK. So on the safety case project, so this was the HY 2004 project, which I was the chair of. The initial workshops took place in 2021. Off the back of that, we scoped out the phase 1 of the project, which was to identify what were the existing legislations and regulations which one would consider within a safety case for hydrogen across the value chain of production, storage, transportation, distribution. What those regulations and legislations are, and if they are set up for projects within the hydrogen arena, or if there are any gaps that would need addressing and potentially pose as blockers for hydrogen developers and hydrogen projects to initiate and establish themselves. So that first piece of work was conducted and started in November 2021, and by October 2022 we were able to publish the findings of that project, which effectively identified that there were gaps that needed addressing. And so off the back of that phase 1 work, we initiated the phase 2 piece of work, which was to develop a specific guidance which went through in details where the specific gaps within the existing regulations and legislations are. And so it highlights where the focus should be given to help ease the burden on developers and project developers in the space of hydrogen when it comes to addressing a safety case. The phase 2 of that work was published in May 2023.
Sorry to interrupt, but there is an attendee with their hand up. Feel free to speak or ask your question.
Okay. Would they like to come in? Are they able to unmute themselves and come in? Or or if not, they can put the question in the Q&A and then one of the panelists will address the question. I'm going to say if we can just put the questions in the Q&A, Amy, that would be the best thing to do.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, if you can skip forward to the next slide. So here is just a highlight of the different working groups that currently exist within the Hydrogen Committee. And so the Hydrogen Committee is chaired by Don Smith from the ENI, and you can see the various projects on your screen now. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So here's the 2 particular publications for this particular work on the safety case. They're available on the ENI website for you to download and get access to those. Next slide, please. Here's just an overview of the jurisdiction of the EI when it comes to different aspects of the hydrogen value chain. Everything in green is effectively within the EI's remit to conduct research on, and those that are in red are largely the responsibility of other organisations such as IGEM. Next slide, please. So these next couple of slides are just to highlight the specific projects that are being conducted. I will say I don't want to go through those now, given the eagerness to move on to the details of the actual projects. So if you would like more information, we will present some contact information at the end of the webinar, and you're able to get more information on any of these existing projects that are currently in train or have been published. And so that was probably the best way to get more information on these projects. So here are the projects proposed for next year. And like I said, if you want any more information regarding any of these projects, or if you're able to contribute technically to any of these projects, the EI is always looking for technical experts to provide their technical abilities and contribute to these projects. Okay, thank you very much. If you've got any questions for what I've just sped through with respect to the hydrogen committee within the Energy Institute, please pop them into the Q&A chat and I will address them. And let's get straight into the actual guidance for the UK hydrogen safety case development onshore and offshore. So our speaker today is Sean Baker. He's a principal consultant at ERM's technical safety team. Sean is a chartered engineer in the field of chemical engineering with a background covering safety in the oil and gas, nuclear, chemicals and energy sectors. Sean's main areas of expertise include risk assessment and modelling of major accident hazards, safety case development, workshop facilitation and process safety management. Currently, Sean is focusing in on the area of low carbon energy transition with significant recent involvement in safety and concept design projects covering green and blue hydrogen production, storage, distribution and end use. He's part of the team developing the Dolphin project, which aims to produce green hydrogen from seawater at commercial scale using offshore floating wind power. And Sean has held key roles in various government-funded feasibility studies for technologies such as liquid organic hydrogen carriers, and has acted as a technical safety consultant in other projects such as the Acorn CCS, Acorn Hydrogen, and the H100 network trial up in Scotland. So without further ado, Sean, please unmute yourself and take us through the findings of the work that you've conducted.
Thanks, Navdeep. If you go to the next slide, please, Tony. So, yeah, as has already been said, I'll be taking you through the work that ERM completed on behalf of the Energy Institute regarding hydrogen safety case legislation. We'll go through some brief background information first and then take you through both of the phases of work completed, which were the initial legislation review and then the more recent guidance document. Next slide. No further introduction needed, thanks to Navdeep. So straight on to the background for the project. So as many of you know, hydrogen has been used safely in a wide range of industrial applications for nearly a century now, particularly in the chemical and refining sectors. There's estimates that there's about 3,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipelines operated worldwide. So these industrial applications provide us with good knowledge of codes and standards and safe operating practices in those contexts. But the expanded role of hydrogen in a low carbon economy, like we've got here in the slide, increases the prevalence of hydrogen and introduces it to new applications. So to enable a safe uptake of hydrogen technologies, producers, distributors, and users will all need to demonstrate that using hydrogen as a new energy vector can be achieved safely. This goes hand in hand with demonstrating that activities are being performed in compliance with the relevant legislation. As many of you will already be aware, the UK health and safety legislative framework is not prescriptive and relies heavily on the concept of demonstrating that risks are as low as reasonably practicable. And generally, this makes reference to relevant good practice. And for many of these new applications of hydrogen, there's relatively little established good practice to refer to, which brings us on nicely to the scope of this project, if we can move to the next slide. So ERM was contracted to perform a comprehensive review of the key UK safety regulations applicable to the hydrogen life cycle, starting, as I said, with the identification and high-level review, And then phase 2 emerged as a recommendation from the first phase and involved the provision of guidance to industry on best practice for compliance with the identified legislation. Next slide. So the main focus areas identified for the study were developed in conjunction with the EI working group and intended to cover the key areas of legislation which operators will need to comply with across the hydrogen economy and in all phases of the project lifecycle from design onwards. I'm not going to read through all of the words on the screen, but hopefully you can get the gist of it. Next slide. So although the intention was to provide a comprehensive review of legislation, the main focus areas of this review were related to production, storage, and distribution or transport of hydrogen, because these were seen as really key drivers for the growth of the hydrogen economy. Next slide. So broadly speaking, these were the focus areas that we aimed in on. So onshore production, offshore production, bulk transport, and onshore storage, with the kind of subcategories under there as well. Next slide. So to start with a brief overview of phase 1, the scope was broken down as follows. We started with a desk-based review and gap analysis of the current legislation, and then moved on to a stakeholder engagement exercise involving interviews and questionnaires before producing a report, identifying the key issues and next steps. I'll take you through the key findings of this review now, starting with a very high-level overview of each area of legislation. Next slide. So the first area, as you see in the title of the report, safety case, looking at the key safety case legislation, it became clear that there was good coverage of the regulations for onshore production, hydrogen and storage under the COMA regulations, hazardous substance consent, and other regulations which just class hydrogen as a hazardous substance. However, there are no regulations which cover offshore hydrogen production unless you have activities ongoing on an installation which also produces hydrocarbons. This was flagged as a gap that we'll discuss further in the slides covering phase 2. Next slide. So moving on to the next category, which was design and asset integrity legislation. The picture was more clear cut here, and there's clear applicability of the key legislation to hydrogen. This is either as a named substance or more generally as a hazardous material. So under regulations like ATEX and DESIR, which many people will be familiar with, hydrogen is treated in a very similar way to other materials. Next. The regulations for pipelines are also relatively straightforward in their applicability. The UK pipeline safety regulations cover all offshore and onshore pipelines, regardless of the material handled. And hydrogen is also subject to some additional requirements if transported above 8 bar, as this will be classed as a dangerous fluid, qualifying the pipeline as a major accident hazard pipeline. Next. Similarly, for road transportation, hydrogen comes under the classification of dangerous goods under existing legislation, and that's when it's transported in gaseous form, liquid, or within chemical carriers like ammonia. So again, no gaps in coverage for this scope. Next slide. Gas safety is a slightly more contentious area. So while hydrogen is covered under the definition of a gas within the Gas Act, the key pieces of legislation covering gas safety, so primarily the GSMR, Gas Safety Management Regulations, are only applicable to networks in which the gas is predominantly methane and there's a maximum hydrogen content of 0.1% specified in that legislation. This was also identified as a clear gap, which was carried forwards to be discussed further in phase 2. Slide. Remaining focus areas for review: environment, emergency response was one of those, and this is another one where existing legislation applies to hydrogen more broadly as a hazardous substance with no real gaps or significant issues identified there. Next slide. And although not strictly part of a safety case, we also looked into the legislation for environmental permitting. And the key finding here is that production of hydrogen is covered by the permitting regulations as a listed activity, so requiring a permit, regardless of the method or material used. So even if we're talking about green hydrogen with 0 emissions, a permit would be required. Next slide. So that's a very quick overview of the kind of initial gap analysis of the legislation. We then looked at the stakeholder engagement piece, so focusing on the UK industrial clusters. The 6 largest clusters are shown there in that picture, to understand the experience of stakeholders in those clusters and their confidence in the current framework. So this was performed using a questionnaire and interviews with key people, the details of which are provided within the report. Some of the common themes that came out were that generally operators found that existing frameworks and principles such as ALARP, demonstrating that risks are as low as reasonably practicable, could be used to develop a basis of safety, even though there is less industry experience to fall back on for best practice. And in many areas, legislation and guidance provides a generic framework, which can then be supplemented by hydrogen-specific standards. As mentioned previously, this is a fairly common feature of the UK legislation, where it's not prescriptive in terms of the standards to be followed, but puts the onus on the operator to demonstrate that they are complying with good practice. There are also a few points raised with regards to the way in which conversions from natural gas to hydrogen could be managed. Next slide. So to summarize phase 1, there were some gaps identified in the legislation, which you've highlighted above. And one of the outcomes of this review was a recommendation to produce a more detailed guidance document for industry, which brings us on to phase 2 of the project. Next. So the phase 2 guidance document, which was published by the EI in May, is made up of the following main sections. Firstly, there was an overview of the key properties and hazards of hydrogen, which may be relevant to safety case development. This was then followed by an overview of each piece of legislation identified, going into quite a lot of detail on the purpose, roles, duties, applicability to hydrogen, and guidance for compliance. There's also some discussion of hydrogen-specific codes and standards. And lastly, we looked at a few case studies for hydrogen projects intended to cover the main parts of the hydrogen life cycle. The focus for this presentation will be on the key findings and recommendations of the review and the case studies. For all the additional details, including some fairly comprehensive guidance for compliance with each piece of legislation, you'll have to refer to the report. So as I mentioned, the document provides information on the key properties and hazards of hydrogen, which you need to consider in a safety case. These would include things like the high buoyancy and diffusivity of hydrogen, which means it will behave differently to other gases, and also the propensity of hydrogen to penetrate joints or other materials when under pressure. The fire and explosion of hazards of hydrogen may also differ to other gases due to properties like its low ignition energy, the fact that hydrogen flames could be invisible, and also the higher likelihood of detonation in the case of explosions. And there's also some specific physical impacts of hydrogen on materials, which we discussed, such as hydrogen embrittlement, high temperature attack, and low temperature embrittlement. Next slide. The report also covers some specific considerations relevant to the different forms of hydrogen storage or transport, summarized here. As you'll be aware, hydrogen has a very high energy content by weight, I believe the highest of any substance, but a very low energy content by volume due to its very low mass density. And this obviously creates an issue for storage and transport. So in order to store or transport sufficient quantities of hydrogen, we either need to compress and store it at high pressure, or liquefy it, or convert it to a carrier with advantageous volumetric energy density. However, all of these solutions can present their own challenges in terms of operational, safety, or environmental considerations, which we went into a little bit more detail within the report. Next slide. So another piece of background information in the report, just for some context, was a comparison of hydrogen to other common fuels. So the first slide here shows density. As I've already mentioned, gaseous hydrogen is has a much lower density than other common fuels, having the lowest molar mass of any substance. As it's much lighter than air, if it's released in an open environment, it will typically rise and disperse rapidly, and this can actually be an advantage in an outside environment. Next slide. In terms of auto-ignition temperature, what you can actually see is that hydrogen is not too dissimilar to natural gas. Next slide. However, the flammability ranges do diverge very significantly. Although the lower flammable limit is comparable to natural gas, hydrogen is clearly ignitable under a much wider range of conditions, and that needs to be taken into account in any case for safety. Next slide. Similarly, comparison of minimum ignition energies shows that hydrogen is much more readily ignitable under stoichiometric conditions. It's worth noting, however, that at low concentrations of hydrogen in air, the energy required to initiate combustion is fairly similar to some other fuels. So moving on to the same areas of legislation we covered in phase one. As mentioned earlier, I'll be summarizing the key issues identified here and not going into the full detail. So obviously refer to the report for all of the information. Starting again with the safety case legislation, this primarily refers to COMA and the Offshore Safety Case Directive for onshore and offshore facilities, respectively. As I mentioned in the phase one slides, key finding is that the COMA regulations do cover hydrogen and other associated substances like ammonia or liquid organic hydrogen carriers. There are no regulations relating to the offshore production of hydrogen unless you're co-locating with oil and gas production facilities. You'd fall outside of the Offshore Safety Case Directive. Project experience and engagement with the authorities, however, does indicate that broad adherence to the relevant aspects of the safety case legislation would be seen as representative of good practice, because that legislation provides a well-established general framework for managing hazardous fluids offshore. There is currently uncertainty, though, about the mechanism by which the HSE would respond to a safety case submitted for a hydrogen facility, as obviously the regulations do not actually apply. As with all aspects of regulatory compliance, close contact with the relevant authorities, so in this case the HSE, would be recommended to ensure that any changes in the legislation or changes in the recommended approach to compliance are identified. Another grey area that we came across on the safety case legislation would be repurposing existing oil and gas infrastructure for green hydrogen production, for example, connecting to a wind farm. And in that case, it's not entirely clear whether the platform would continue to be covered by the offshore safety regulations when oil and gas production ceases. However, as per the advice for new facilities, best practice would be to start by following the legislation, and in this case, submitting a revision to the safety case. Next slide. So for design and asset integrity, as we mentioned before, this is ATEX, DESIR, carriage of dangerous goods, pressure equipment safety regulations, and others on a similar theme. And hydrogen is generally well covered by this legislation as a hazardous fluid. It is important, however, to consider the specific properties of hydrogen when designing plant or equipment, and considering aspects such as safety distances in order to make sure that you are complying. As discussed earlier as well, properties such as hydrogen's wider flammability range and lower ignition energy can result in a higher likelihood of ignition, resulting in fires or explosions. And flame speeds for hydrogen are also higher, therefore potentially giving greater explosion overpressures in congested areas. This means that in some cases, standard modeling or calculation methodologies might need to be adjusted to support design. Other properties such as hydrogen's lower viscosity and propensity for leakage would need to be considered. And common to other legislation, specific standards are not identified as requirements in the legislation, but there are a number of hydrogen-specific standards for various aspects of design and asset integrity, which can be followed to demonstrate best practice. Next slide. With regards to gas safety, The GSMR regulations in their current form do leave a number of gaps. So operators of networks delivering a blend of natural gas and hydrogen to the public would need to apply to the HSE for an exemption from the 0.1% hydrogen limit in GSMR that we mentioned. This is currently done on a time-bound, site-specific basis, which we'll come back to in the case studies later. A further issue is that the GSMR regulations only apply to networks conveying a gas which is wholly or predominantly methane, and this means that there is actually no way for the HSE to regulate networks carrying more than 50% hydrogen at present. So 100% hydrogen networks fall outside of this. The existing legislation can be used as a framework to demonstrate safe operation. However, this is obviously still a key gap. With regards to GSIUR, so gas safety, installation and use regulations, these apply in all domestic premises using hydrogen as a gas. However, in non-domestic settings, the regulations would only apply when hydrogen is not the main constituent gas in the mixture. So again, more than 50% hydrogen networks would not be covered. However, employers may use the guidance along with these regulations as a mechanism to comply with their broader duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act. Next slide. On the topic of emergency response, not too much further to say. Emergencies involving hydrogen are likely to be similar in nature to other emergencies involving fire or explosions. But as we've mentioned previously, the unique properties of hydrogen do need to be considered when assessing risks and developing emergency plans. Operators have to notify the fire and enforcing authorities when significant quantities of hydrogen are stored on site. Although, of course, good engagement and cooperation with local fire authorities is recommended for all sites. Next slide. Environmental permitting, final focus area that we looked at for the legislation. As we've already said, a key point is that all production of hydrogen is a regulated activity, irrespective of the method, and you need to apply for a Part A1 permit. And this includes methods of hydrogen production with no emissions. Other associated activities, for example, carbon capture and storage, are also regulated activities. And if it's carried out on the same site by the same operator, that can be put on the same permit. All regulated activities should be carried out in accordance with best available techniques published by the EU, or better alternatives, and obviously must respect emission limits defined in these BAT documents. There are slightly different requirements in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, but that's described a bit further in the report itself. Next slide. So for the final part of the project, we looked at 4 representative case studies, which were chosen in conjunction with the EI working group and intended to cover the main application areas within the study. Desk-based research was carried out, as well as approaching project stakeholders for comment to understand any challenges or experiences these types of projects had complying with legislation. So the selected projects were the Hydrogen to Humber H2H project for onshore production and storage, the Dolphin offshore production project, and as we'll discuss shortly, we have a gas network case study, which is largely theoretical, given a lack of a current project covering, a full transmission and distribution network. And finally, although not necessarily the most challenging in terms of regulatory compliance, refueling stations were identified as an area of interest as one of the most common hydrogen projects being built at present, and also due to the fact that they do come into close proximity to the public. Next slide. So the H2H project, as a brief overview, involves the production of hydrogen via reforming of natural gas with carbon capture and storage. That's blue hydrogen for people who like their colours. This project aims to decarbonise the Humberside industrial cluster. The associated Aldeburgh hydrogen storage project looks at upgrading existing underground natural gas storage to cold hydrogen and will be connected by pipeline. Next. In terms of the key legislation for this project, all of the potential sites would be classed as lower tier COMA. However, given a far larger inventory of hydrogen, I think it's up to 8,000 tons, potentially more, that could be stored at the Aldborough site underground. This site would have to comply with upper tier COMA requirements. As with any project, general health and safety legislation applies. And on the permitting side, environmental permits will be required for activities including hydrogen production, CCS, combustion, and discharge to water and waste treatment as well. Feedback from stakeholders in the project identified a couple of issues encountered to date. One of the first ones was the COMA assessment for the sites, aggregating multiple hazardous substances. A common issue that comes up on projects of this type is that chemicals used in carbon capture storage processes are often commercially sensitive, but still need to be assessed to determine if they are dangerous substances under the COMA legislation. Another issue encountered was that there is no single best available techniques document for hydrogen production with carbon capture and storage, but it's noted that documents from other industries could of course be helpful. Finally, it was identified that there's a lack of an approved method for modeling low-level releases of carbon dioxide as a toxic dense gas has been compressed for storage. Slide. The next case study is the Dolphin project. This is a government-funded project being led by ERM, looking at the offshore production of green hydrogen from seawater by electrolysis. A subsea pipeline will be used to bring the hydrogen to shore, and then there'll be an onshore facility for receipt of the gas at shore. Next slide. As discussed earlier, there's no legislation for standalone offshore hydrogen production. However, legislation and guidance from other related industries, including offshore oil and gas and renewables, is being followed to try and demonstrate best practice. The onshore facilities will only include a small amount of storage below the COMA thresholds. And for the offshore facilities, the offshore safety case regulations will be followed. There is a design notification which will be submitted to the offshore major accidents regulator, and a safety case will follow as the design progresses. As we mentioned previously, there is currently uncertainty about the mechanism by which the regulator will respond to this safety case for a hydrogen facility, as the regulations do not actually apply. There's a lot of ongoing work on the safety case for this project, including identification of major accident hazards, risk assessment and modeling, identification of safety critical elements and performance standards, and demonstrating that risks are as low as practicable, very similar to any other safety case for an offshore installation. An external body has also been engaged to undertake independent verification in line with the requirements of the safety case regulations and other relevant legislation. Next slide. Moving on to the next study. As I said before, this is a theoretical gas network, as there is currently no hydrogen example that includes all aspects of the network. So the image on the right there is taken from the GSMR regulations showing what they would define as a network. So this case study is based on a combination of the findings of various other projects, including high deploy, high NTS, high net, and others, and including some desk-based research as well. Next slide. So as I've mentioned a couple of times already, blended hydrogen networks would need to apply for an exemption from the maximum limit set by GSMR. The high deploy project is an example of one which successfully applied for this exemption. Generally, the request for an exemption can use the same basic content as a safety case, aligned with the requirements of Schedule 1 of the GSMR regulations. Pipelines are also covered under the pipeline safety regulations, as I've already mentioned, where they can be classed as major accident pipelines, depending on the pressure. And another finding that came up during this was that there's a need for some additional work developing safety standards for pipelines for hydrogen, in relation to aspects such as the minimum safe distances from hydrogen pipelines to buildings. Some of the key conclusions of this case study were that the current method of the time-bound exemption for trials of blended hydrogen is not an efficient way to roll out wider hydrogen blending across the UK and could act as a blocker to future development. And furthermore, there is no legislation covering 100% or majority networks. Next slide. Moving on to the final case study of hydrogen refueling stations. The first finding is that hydrogen inventories at stations are likely to be below the thresholds for coma or hazardous substances consent. In the majority of the cases that we looked at, only a few hundred kilograms of gas were typically stored at refueling stations. The applicable legislation then is standard regulations such as DESIR or the pressure systems safety regulations, which would apply to any sites handling hazardous substances or using pressure equipment with no specific requirements relating to hydrogen. Transport of hydrogen by road would also need to comply with the Carriage of Dangerous Goods Act, as hydrogen is defined as dangerous goods. And on the subject of permitting, it was actually found that where hydrogen production is co-located at refueling stations using electrolysis, it may be possible to apply for a low impact permit from the Environment Agency, which is less onerous than applying for a full Part A1 permit. An example of one of these refueling stations with electrolysis on site, which successfully applied for a low impact permit, is the Horiba Octopus energy refueling station. I understand there's also been consultation by Natural Resources Wales to offer a similar type of permit for installations in Wales. Some other findings relating to refueling stations include the fact that at the time of writing the report, the transposition of the alternative fuels legislation from the EU to UK is ongoing and incomplete, with the UK regulations still lacking reference to some standards. A lack of compliant equipment in the UK was also identified, for example, refueling nozzles. And there are also some shortcomings in the UK test apparatus, particularly in regards to the testing of fuel dispensers, measuring hydrogen quality and metering. And finally, the UK MOT currently does not cover hydrogen vehicles. Next slide. So on to some of the key conclusions. Key findings were that the UK legislation is generally well developed in terms of hydrogen, as you can see from a number of successful projects that have been completed or are in development, but there are some gaps that still remain. It's unclear how the offshore safety case regulations can be applied to hydrogen, although these regulations do provide a good framework for managing hazardous fluids offshore. We also said a couple of times, but the current method of time-bound exemptions for trials of blended hydrogen are not seen as an efficient way to roll out wider hydrogen blending and will act as a blocker. And also the GSMR regulations do not apply to networks conveying more than 50% hydrogen, making it difficult for the HSE to legislate for 100% hydrogen gas networks or community trials. So as a closing remark, I would emphasize that this is a rapidly moving space. The guidance is based on best available information at the time of writing. And as the sector progresses, so will the guidance on what constitutes best practice, and potentially the legislation too, where I'm sure that the relevant authorities are aware of the current gaps. So that's all of our slides. Happy to take any questions at the end.
Thank you, Sean, for taking us through that work. We've got a couple of questions and some comments in the Q&A chat, so let's address those now, if that's okay with you. So we'll go with the first one. So this is from Anonymous, but the question is, from the perspective of a commercial organization looking to be an off-taker of hydrogen from planned hydrogen networks, where there would be no or very limited storage, what would the relevant legislation be?
So if there's no or very limited storage, you're looking at standard regulations like DESIR, ATEX, pressure system safety regulations. Depending on the use of the gas, there may be some requirements under GSI-UR. However, you wouldn't be falling under COMA or anything significant there. I'd assume the network itself would be outside of the scope of the organization kind of using that hydrogen. But we've kind of addressed some of the issues relating specifically to networks carrying hydrogen in the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Sean. There are a couple of comments from Andrew, but I'll share those at the end. We've got another question from Can we ensure everybody's on mute? Thank you very much. Got another question here from Almas. His question is, as ammonia is frequently mentioned as an energy carrier, why wasn't ammonia included in the density comparison between the different energy carriers? So when you did the comparison to other fuels, we had hydrogen compared with natural gas, propane, and gasoline vapor. And so it was just a question of why was ammonia emitted from that comparison?
Yeah, that's a fair point. So I think that those graphs in the presentation were just intended to put hydrogen in the context of other sort of very commonly used fuels, which ammonia kind of didn't fall into that band of. I think within the actual document itself, there is a comparison of hydrogen carriers where we look at, we compared ammonia and some of the common liquid organic hydrogen carriers as well, referencing their energy density and other properties. So there is more information on that in the report, but the slides were just a kind of putting hydrogen into the context of things that people are familiar with.
Thanks, Sean. So yeah, so hopefully, Finn, you can find some more details within the published report. Okay, next question here. Thank you, Finn, for your question. Next question here is from KK Lai. Thank you, KK Lai. The question is regarding public engagement and public perception. So the UK's Minister of Energy Efficiency and Green Finance called off the first UK hydrogen village trial due to lack of local support. Another project, Redcar, will be could face a similar situation. Sean, what's your comment for those cases where lack of public confidence for using hydrogen is safe?
Yeah, it's a good point. There are, I've been involved in some of the hydrogen trial projects as well, and I think the communication about it is very important. I don't think we can necessarily say that hydrogen is kind of more or less safe than natural gas. Definitively, is just very different. And if you kind of treat it in accordance with its properties and take all the necessary precautions, I think there is evidence that it can be used safely. Whether or not the downstream domestic use is the best application for hydrogen going forwards is an open question. But I think communication and the media definitely plays into people's fears a bit there.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, a couple of comments from Andrew Gorsden, if you've got anything to add. So the first one was about the regulatory reform Fire Safety Order 2005 was not mentioned within the regs and legs that were looked within this work. So apparently it has a crossover with the DESIR within Articles 12 and 16. So whilst there is reference to many emergency response, but no mention to the Fire and Rescue Service Act 2004, and I know you briefly mentioned the emergency services, but is there anything else you'd like to add to that point?
So off the top of my head, I can't remember the full content of what is in the report. The slides are just a kind of summary of the key points. It may be that we did include a bit more information, but I can certainly take that question away and double check it.
Yeah, sure. And then the final quick point from Andrew was on hydrogen refueling stations being an interesting topic, given that you're bringing it brings the public arena into the space of hydrogen, where fire and public safety takes lead. And in Andrew's experience, is that the situation takes PSC into an unfamiliar environment and having to communicate hazard and risks with less informed duty holders. And so different skills will be required in communications in this environment.
Yeah, so I think some of the earlier refueling stations did actually have a requirement for users to be trained before they were allowed to use the refueling stations. So I'm not sure if that's common to, a lot of the other refueling stations that are opening up, but it's certainly a key concern, kind of making sure human factors are taken into account in incidents where the public can interact.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Two more questions, then we will have to move on to Tony Byrne's presentation. So one
just a short comment.
Yeah, comment in, Wilfred.
Yeah, my name is Wilfred Bayer, the Director Energy Kilifi County Government from Kenya. As a country, we are looking to explore the aspect of hydrogen fuel so that we can add into our Kenyan energy mix. So I just wanted to know what policies and regulations do we have to put into place before we start such endeavors?
So the focus of the review that we carried out was obviously focused on the UK legislation. Yes, it's quite a big question on kind of where do you start if you don't have that equivalent framework. So I to be honest, I'm not familiar with what legislation you already have in place in your country. So I'm not sure I can really provide a good answer to that question.
Yeah.
For now, we just have policies in relation to renewable energy, which we are covering the aspect of solar, wind, and some bits of regulations in relation to solar and the petroleum industry. But I was looking at, do we have to develop specific policies, regulations for the hydrogen fuel? Just like the way there is another sector that we are exploring, which is the addition of nuclear power into our energy mix. So we have the Kenya Nuclear Regulatory Authority, which is trying to develop a specific framework for the nuclear industry. So I don't know whether this hydrogen aspect, can we embed it into the policies and regulations for renewable, or do we develop a completely separate framework for it? Those are some of the things that I was trying to check around.
Yeah, so I think it depends. In the UK, there is some legislation that is just where hydrogen is just classed as a hazardous fluid, and so it's treated like anything else, like natural gas, anything like that. So that there is very little legislation that is specifically has been developed for hydrogen. Hydrogen is named as a named substance in regulation like the COMA regulations, where there are some specific requirements for hydrogen, but in terms of new legislation specifically for hydrogen, there currently isn't really much that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Sean. Wilfred, what I'll say is if you've got any other questions or comments, if you want to send them offline to the Energy Institute, and we'll funnel them down and get an appropriate response for you. But we will have to move on now, given we've got one more presentation from Tony on this stuff in JIP. Thank you, Wilfred. So final two questions for Sean then. So Sean, the first one is just Chris Stratton is wondering what your views were on the provisions within the energy bill, and whether you think the gaps that you've identified would be covered, e.g., for example, the gaps within GSMR.
To be honest, I'm not that familiar with the energy bill, so
okay, that's fine.
Not sure I can provide an answer on that.
No problem. And then the final question from Anil Kapoor is, are you able to elaborate on the applicability of low impact permit for HRS? What storage volumes were considered, for example, in the basis of low impact permit?
Yeah, so I think environmental permitting is typically based on kind of activities rather than storage. So the fact that it's a low impact permit is not related to storage volume, but on a basis of the fact that there is limited potential for discharge to environment in terms of, discharges to the atmosphere or water or anything like that.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, we're going to let you have a break now. So thank you very much, Sean, for your presentation and for addressing the questions within the Q&A. Thank you once again to those that have put questions in. Please continue to do so for the remainder of the webinar. We'll swiftly move on to our second and final presentation, which is on the Safin JIP project. So Tony Byrne will be presenting now. Tony is currently the head of construction and EPC for Protium Green Solutions, where where they are developing and constructing green hydrogen facilities. Prior to joining Protium, Tony worked for 12 years with Thornton Tomasetti, formerly known as MMI Engineering, working primarily in oil and gas, major hazards, including safety case development, safety case management, ALARP, hazard, and NVID studies. He was co-chair of the CCSA Technical Working Group and the chair of the CCSA's CCS BAT Working Group. Prior to MMI Engineering, Tony worked on blue hydrogen projects with Progressive Energy and BP, and he has also been a director of asset management and engineering services for Enron Europe, developing CCGT power plants in Europe and Japan, and working in operating and maintenance for the Monsanto Seal Sands facility, which is an upper tier coma site. So safe to say, Tony is very well qualified for what he's about to speak about. So Tony, if I can ask you to come off mute and kickstart your presentation.
Yeah, off mute now. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Yes, thanks for that, Navdeep. Okay, last year we started off a working group within the Energy Institute, HY 2203, which is looking at incident data management and support for QRAs. As we started that work, we became aware of the Safin GIP, which is set up by a number of companies, which I'll list on the next couple of slides. But basically, it's a GIP to close knowledge gaps around hydrogen, CCS, and ammonia, sharing the learnings, developing risk-based methodologies for assessing hydrogen risk and supporting QRA, etc. Although it's looking at hydrogen, ammonia, and CCS, the emphasis is primarily on hydrogen. Go on the next slide, please. Okay, as you'll see there, the project at the moment, the GIP, is heavily Norwegian-based, with various companies and SafeTech heading up and managing the project. They are open to new partners before they start phase 2 of the project. They started last year, I think in March 22, and carried out a program of work which looked at incident database structures, establishing what data was already out there from a hydrogen incident point of view and CCS, and establishing a knowledge base from oil and gas and bringing in some new data that Safin will produce, looking at the knowledge base that's out there and developing work on leak frequency models for process equipment, storage, transfer operations, and also looking at ignition probability models and recommendations for improved safety design. So we can go on the next slide, please. So basically, the overall objectives are to establish what knowledge we need to develop risk-based methodologies to enable the safe, cost-efficient design across the renewable sector that's dealing with the more hazardous materials in the transition. So it's to set up the environment for sharing the knowledge, and it's looking at developing continuous development of best practices safe design technologies. Next slide. So what phase 2 objectives are to obviously take forward the work from phase 1 and looking at implementing the database and a framework for sharing of the data and knowledge across the industry. So, and that's looking at the processes to gather the information around incidents, loss of containment, etc., quality assurance of that, and analysis of the data, and looking at both ignited and the unignited loss of containment incidents that could have the major hazard potential. Where they've developed it going to establish new knowledge and information about loss of containment and the ignition probabilities. You notice from Sean's slide, the low ignition energy is a significant factor within the hydrogen world. They're also looking at the failure mechanisms, causes in dedicated use cases, and furthering the ignition study on the ignition mechanism of hydrogen. And then it carries on with developing new and improved loss of containment ignition probability models. Okay, next slide. So nearly at the end here, folks. But EI, we've been discussing involvement with SafeN for a number of months now. The SafeN board had just recently voted to engage with the Energy Institute as an associate member. We won't be able to get all of the data, but one of the key things I think is that we can contribute from the wide knowledge base that we have within the Energy Institute members into the SafeN project and help build that database. So one of the purposes of this small presentation is to ask anybody out there, can your company contribute to the database via our working group, revamped into 2305, and contact Tony Needham at the Energy Institute or myself with any data. But we've discussed things like anonymizing data and everything like that to keep things reasonably confidential on that front. But one of the key things is members, anybody can become full paying partners of SafeN. And there's an email address there, Linda Flottam at SafeTech. If anybody wants to contact Linda, she can give you the information. It's a reasonably significant cost, I guess. I think it's about 95k, something like that was the previous cost for companies, which is one of the reasons why, as an associate member, the Energy Institute will not be privy to all the data that's coming out. But suffice to say that eventually what will come out of this GIP is a database of incidents which people can subscribe to, utilize in developing quantitative risk assessment studies, etc. So that's a brief overview of SafeN.
Thank you very much, Tony. Yeah, a very, very important project to the industry. So any support that any of the participants on the webinar today can contribute or provide, please get in touch. The email addresses that were on the previous slide, the slides will be shared with all of the registered participants today, so you'll be able to get those email addresses and reach out. If there are any questions for Tony with regards to SafeN, please put them in the chat now. Oh, we have one actually. So Tony, do you have input into preliminary design of the hydrogen carrier ammonia vessel being developed by Statkraft? It's a P2X floater harnessing wind energy for the production of ammonia.
Personally, I'm not aware of that project directly, but I know we did have somebody go to one of the workshops, attended one of the workshops with SafeN earlier this year. I guess that's one of the things to mention as well, that there will be invitations coming out from SafeN where they have workshops where members of the EI can potentially attend those workshops. They're very, very keen to get involvement outside of just the Norwegian businesses that were listed there. So we've got the health and safety executive on our team, and a number of other companies as well. But anybody who's interested, please get in touch, and I'll ask the question about that particular project.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, I'm not. Okay, yeah. Thank you for the question as well. So there are no further questions in the chat, so we'll move on. So the next hydrogen webinar will be taking place on the 31st of August. It's a 1 hour webinar focusing on the hydrogen infrastructure integration project. And it will be a presentation of the research report, which was produced by PennSpen, looking at the hydrogen value chain infrastructure integration, interfacing analysis and landscape review. So please, if you are interested, in the same way you've joined today, please join and sign up for this webinar taking place at the end of next month. And all details can be found on the Energy Institute's website. Next slide, please. Okay, so I believe this is the final slide. So if you have any other questions that we didn't get to cover today, or prop up later, or more importantly, if you are able to contribute to any of the existing hydrogen committee working groups or projects that are currently underway, if you're able to provide any technical expertise or would like to contribute in any other way, please do reach out to ourselves. So Tony Needham and Chim, those are the two the email addresses you can see on your screen right now. And then if you're able to support Tony Byrne's project, the Safe End project, then please reach out to Linda, and you can see her email address on the screen too. And finally, if you would like to become a member of the Energy Institute, there are plenty of benefits that Tony Needham shared earlier today. Then please get in touch with the organization, and you can see at the bottom of the screen the email address for you to do that. So I believe that's the final slide. And so on this note, we will thank everybody for their participation. It was great to see, I think, almost 130 participants at its peak today. So thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. So if I can give a final thanks to all our panelists as well. Thank you to Sean and Tony Byrne for your presentations. And we'll see you all at the next one. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.